Welcome to the Forge's Marxism 101 series. This presentation has been researched, written, and presented by me, Noemi, of Hakami. So I want to talk about how I personally came to be interested in the Chinese Revolution. First, you need to know that China colonized the Philippine Islands. I am Filipinx. Before Spain, before the United States, before Japan, China was a colonizer of the Philippines. So when I was 10 years old in the United States, I was having trouble finding representation. I loved reading books, but I couldn't find anything about Filipinx people. So the closest that I could come to representation was reading about Chinese people and Chinese Americans in books written by Chinese Americans, because the deep culture stuff reflected in Filipinx culture, and I could relate to the characters and the different things that they would go through. For example, filial piety stuff. And so when I was 13 years old, after I had been exposed to Imperial China and what was going on there, and I was a little bit familiar with the revolutionary side of the story, I started to really take it seriously and go after books specifically about revolutionary China and what was going on. So let's talk about Mao's life. He was born in 1893, and at that time, Japan had adopted the Gregorian calendar. That's the calendar we use. Also, the World's Columbian Exposition was going on in Chicago. That is also known as the World's Fair. Mao turned 30 in 1923. At that time, there were still KKK attacks happening, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was established. And Mao passed around 1976, anywhere from 1976 to the mid-80s. In the United States, we have not got very accurate information about how long Mao had lived. The books that I have read and Wikipedia differ. I've had 3 confirmed different dates of Mao's death, and so I'm not going to touch that one so much. Next, in 1949, this is when Mao was first in office. That was the year George Orwell published 1984. There was also the Cold War going on. So what people don't think about a lot when they think about Mao is the fact that he was married. And I'm going to explain why this is significant. Mao was married 4 times at different intervals. The wives did not overlap. And this is a cultural thing that we in the United States will not think about. In Imperial China, it was perfectly acceptable and encouraged for men who had money and power to have multiple wives. And often the situation was abusive and the wives were pitted against each other. They had to compete. And so for Mao to have been married multiple times and believe in divorce and remarriage and not having multiple wives at the same time is significant. Before we get into the quotes, I want to do an introduction to the Little Red Book. The book, we call it the Little Red Book in the United States. I think this moniker must have come about in the 1960s or 70s, but what it's really called is Quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong. The Little Red Book was banned in the 1960s when the Black Panther Party was organizing, and so the way that the Black Panther Party made money was by importing these books illegally and selling them. And what the Black Panther Party also did was that they studied the Little Red Book. They got some cultural and historical information from this book and also strategic information. They would sit and discuss it with each other, pore over it. The way that this book worked in China was that these books were printed en masse and they were given to everyone, so that everyone could learn to read, because literacy was not at a high rate in Imperial China. Everyone could learn to read, and everyone could get familiar with what Mao's platform was on a variety of different subjects. And so when we read this in the United States, we have to remember that these books were published for Chinese people. They were for Chinese revolutionaries, everyone in China. So there's going to be lots of cultural and historical barriers for us when we're studying it. I once read an example of Mao's writing when he was talking about the arranged marriages in Imperial China. They often happened when children were too young to consent, and he explained that he was against arranged marriages. He wanted people to be able to choose who they marry. He had an early idea of consent and had strong feelings about consent. And he said that the non-consensual sex involved in marriage was intergenerational sexual assault. And it blew me away when I read this. This is before the feminist movement in the United States of America. And he spoke out about it. He wrote about it early on in his career. And that's important to know about Mao. So in the 1960s, Mao wrote a statement supporting the American Negroes in their just struggle against racial discrimination by U.S. imperialism. The statement itself is definitely problematic, what's in here anyways. However, in the 1960s, for an East Asian person to be in power and use his voice to support Black people in the United States is significant. So this is one of my favorite quotes, if not my favorite quote of Mao's from 1945. It says, "Everything reactionary is the same. If you don't hit it, it won't fall. This is also like sweeping the floor. As a rule, where the broom does not reach, the dust will not vanish of itself." And I think that we can learn a lot from this quote and this sentiment in the United States. This is another quote that I like a lot. This is from the Little Red Book as well. It says, "The enemy will not perish of himself. Neither the Chinese reactionaries nor the aggressive forces of the U.S. imperialism in China will step down from the stage of history of their own accord." So this is from 1948, and I think that we can take this to heart because we get a lot of people who say capitalism is in decay, it's going to fall when the revolution comes. But Mao takes the position that you make revolution. You must do it like sweeping the floor, sweeping the dust out. Revolution is active. And we can see that this is true because Mao pulled off a revolution. So I think that we should listen. "After the enemies with guns have been wiped out, there will be enemies without guns. They are bound to struggle desperately against us, and we must never regard these enemies lightly. If we do not now raise and understand the problem in this way, we shall commit the gravest mistakes." 1949. Again, I think that the Chinese Revolution itself is evidence that this is important. And seeing how long China was able to stay in a revolutionary phase points to the fact that this is an important sentiment, and we will need to understand this as people in the United States of America. So another popular quote has to do with capitalists and their running dogs. This comes from a speech by Mao. I just want you to know that when you use running dogs, this refers to like imperialism, sexism, etc. The dogs that run with capitalism in the pack. And this is from Mao. When you use this, you're using a Maoist term. Also, if you did not know this quote, "Women hold up half the sky," this is from a larger speech from Mao. So when you say this and when you quote this, you're quoting Mao. It's not a Chinese proverb as it's presented in the United States. It is a Mao quote. "We on earth hold up the heavens. If we do not hold up the heavens, everything comes crashing down on us." So this is like referring to the labor that it takes to keep our lives manageable. So this next quote is about Chiang Kaishek, who was the leader of the Kuomintang, which Mao was a part of for a short period. The Kuomintang struggled against Japan, but then eventually joined forces with Japan. And so in China, there were three groups battling Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang. There was Japan's imperial forces. And then there was the Red Guard, which is the Chinese Communist forces. This quote says, Chiang Kaishek always tries to wrestle every ounce of power and every ounce of gain from the people. And our policy is to give him tit for tat and to fight for every inch of land. We act after his fashion. He always tries to impose war on the people, one sword in his left hand and another in his right. We take up swords too, following his example. As Chiang Kai-shek is now sharpening his swords, we must sharpen ours too. This is from 1945. So let's talk briefly about the rumors about Mao. I just want to clarify that Mao is not Genghis Khan. I don't know why people get these two things mixed up, these two people mixed up. He's not Genghis Khan. There's a lot of racial yellow peril connotations when people in the United States talk about Mao, especially at the time that he was alive. And so it's crucial to remember that he wasn't just like this pillager who went and just killed people for fun because he wanted riches and land, etc. You know, the same rumor has been cast on Che Guevara. Same kind of rumor has been cast on Malcolm X. Like, there are people walking around today who believe that Malcolm X killed white people for being white. And that was like some sort of prejudicial thing that happened. He didn't. But when you examine rumors, you must also examine the purpose behind the rumor. You must also examine who's telling you this rumor and what are their motives. So another really popular rumor, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, is that Mao killed millions. Some people say billions, which is odd. Sometimes people claim that Mao killed more than the population of China at the time that he was in office. So when we also examine the strife that the Chinese people went through during the revolution, we must also acknowledge sanctions. Trade sanctions, political sanctions. So we're most familiar with the blockade put on Cuba. That was an official blockade. And we must also recognize that sanctions are an act of war. It's basically like if you've read a fantasy book where people are stuck in the castle and they're just trying to wait it out, they're trying to fight their way out, but they can't get any food in and they have to survive on like what they have within the castle. That's like being under siege. A sanction is kind of like being under siege. And so China had unofficial sanctions on it during the revolution. When you read about the scarcity and famine, also take into consideration that capitalist countries were working against China in many ways, not just with guns and ammo. So I want to thank you for watching. Again, I'm Noemi of Hakami, and I hope that you learned something and you can get started on your own journey researching the Chinese Revolution and learning from Mao's quotes. Goodbye.